out there, and welcome to Answers for Today. My name's Bill Wynn, and I'm here in Studio G with Pastor Terry Reynolds from Agape Chapel here in Orange County, Southern California, and Pastor Chris Quintana from Old Path in Cypress, California. We've got a lot to talk about today. There's a lot of things going on, and Pastor Terry, why don't you kind of set the stage and we'll get this show going.
Yes. I'm so excited to be here with everybody and Chris and Bill again. You know, as we think at the time and age that we're living in right now, I have in my hand, maybe some of you guys might remember it. It might come, you might have to go to some type of museum to see it now. Smithsonian. It's called a flip phone. Doesn't it, remember all of us used to have these in our pockets? But now this technology has gone so far away from what we used to think was the cool thing. You know, Bill and Chris, we just, in recent time here, Israel had a jet, maybe you'll be able to explain it better, Bill, fly over around Syria, and it was shot down. And it really brought a lot of buzz to us dealing with technology, where it's all going, and I think it plays into prophecy that we're looking at, where Israel is really coming up with some new technology to protect their planes and aircrafts and all that. And we're going to be getting into Ezekiel after a little bit here, but I thought we'd take some time to talk about events that are happening in our world right now. Bill, why don't you give us a little story on this?
Well, and a couple of the things that have happened, of course, recently is that there was a drone that wandered into Israeli airspace over the last week, and it was taken out by an Israeli Apache helicopter. And in retaliation, of course, Israel sent a number of fighter jets over into Syria to take out the drone launch pads and some anti-aircraft batteries and the like. And I understand that even after that sortie of jets went over, there were 5 more flights, I guess, of Israeli jets that went into Syria and took out various targets. And when one of those Israeli jets was coming back, it got targeted by what we now know was a Soviet-built, and we think even Soviet-manned anti-aircraft facility with a surface-to-air missile. And the missile was fired at the jet and got within a couple hundred feet of the jet and exploded and sent shrapnel into the plane and damaged the plane sufficiently to where the 2 Israeli pilots had to eject. One of the pilots was injured fairly severely. The other one, I think, not too bad, but of course just ejecting from a plane like that is a pretty serious event and it can be hard on you. They both landed safely in Israeli territory. They got them to the hospital. They're both going to be okay. The plane went down in Israeli territory, and it was a total loss, I think close to $500 million worth of airplane. But it's one of the first F-16, so it's a U.S.-made plane that has been taken down in a long time. And our planes, of course, are the best technology that's out there. And what it basically proves, and what, of course, the Syrians and the Iranians and the Soviets that back them are all claiming, is that, well, this is a whole new era of technology because we can now take out the U.S. technology with our anti-aircraft and surface-to-air missiles and radars. Interesting, 2 or 3 points are very interesting. One is that it's a Russian-made technology that's coming back, and we're going to study that some more in the book that was written thousands of years ago here in a minute. And secondly, that there's a major amount that's going on in cyber warfare now, and in the ability for all countries to fight one another with computer and radar and various microwave technologies in such a way that they've even talked about having dumb engines on jets now that you can take out the entire system of the airplane, the navigation and all the avionics and everything else and munitions, but you won't be able to take out the engine controls they will be completely shielded so that the plane can at least still fly.
So they're putting some type of bubble wrap that
Right,
will guard
around
it
the engine, to protect it.
from cyber.
Right, and from the electronic sort of warfare that they can attack these planes with. And in fact, in one article, they said that the Israelis now have the ability to control an entire squadron of airplanes and take it out from a distance just using cyber warfare.
So if they're flying in and they see these planes coming at them, they can hit a button and mess up all their navigation
Right.
and everything else.
And basically cause them to crash or run into each other or whatever.
It's basically EMP.
Yeah,
EMP.
Fry
type
the
thing.
yeah,
Fries
fry the
everything.
systems.
Yeah. So what we see is not only the involvement of Russia, but also a very quick advance in the technology that's being used back and forth over there. And we know that the bases that are right at the northern edge of Israel, which of course is biblical as well, on the north end are supplied and have now been reinforced and taken over by Russian troops and backed by the Iranian troops that are also there that actually are traversing Iraq on a highway that the Iranians built.
Why don't you, Chris, why don't you jump in whenever you want, but Bill, why don't you tell the audience about this highway that, that's being built from, you said from Iran across, because that's going to come in very interesting as we get into further about not only the Battle of Armageddon, as what different battles that we're going to be seeing going forward. Why don't you tell the audience?
Well, and I'm sure that this will eventually be targeted by Israel, but over the last few months, as Iran had moved into Iraq, and if you look at the geography, there's the ability, if you can traverse Iraq, from Iran to Iraq, across Iraq, you can get to the southern end of Syria, which has a border adjacent to Israel. And they constructed basically a superhighway across there that allowed them to move troops and munitions and heavy cargo both ways into Syria to supply their troops and their folks that were over there as a result of their occupation of Iraq over the last year or two, when, of course, the Obama administration elected to leave Iraq several years ago. So bottom line is that whole area over there, the geopolitics of the influence of Gog and Magog are increasing, and the armament level and the number of troops even in the immediate surrounding region is increasing dramatically.
Chris, I think it's amazing that we see this little nation of Israel that, it still seems to be the main center of all the, politics of the world.
Sure.
And like Bill was saying, these troop movements, they have an agenda. They don't want Israel to continue, do they, when you go over there?
No, that's been clear. Here's the interesting thing is I'm hearing Bill, lay all of that out. We know that there's been conflict in that part of the world as long as anybody can remember, thousands of years, in fact. And in the history of Israel now back in the land, going forward from 1948, it's not as though there haven't been belligerents in the area before. The same old cast of characters has hated Israel and looked to wipe them out more than once. The difference is now Russia's involved with this one. And if you understand the geography of it, I'm sure you'll be able to put up a map of this.
Yeah, we'll put one up.
Exactly. When you're looking around Galilee, you're in the northern part of Israel. And when you look to the east of Galilee, there's the Golan Heights, which really pretty much run the rest of the northern part as it goes towards Syria. So it's interesting that you have this highway that's there, and why Iran is making such inroads into Lebanon. Because if you're going to try to come from the north, like all of the nations have done, through the years, you come down from the north because it's the flat land kind of an area. That takes you through Syria into Lebanon. Hezbollah is a wholly owned subsidiary of Iran. So no surprise, you would expect, this is exactly what you would expect to see. And so that's what they keep saying. Now, Syria's making its threats, Assad's making his threats, backed by Russia with all of the armaments that are there. And people that would traditionally be kind of at odds with one another, Syria is making it possible to bring all of that stuff from Iran into Lebanon, which ultimately makes perfect sense. If you're going to try to do something in any way, face to face, hand to hand kind of thing, that comes down from the north. Because other than that, you have a barrier that's more than 30 miles long called the Golan Heights that keeps you from coming in from Syria.
Yeah, and they're really being empowered where they feel like they can do it, and so it's kind of like they're trying to punch the bear, see how far they can go with it, and they're making some progress. And for us to really to understand this, and I would hope that you would grab your Bible, maybe where you could take some notes. We would like to go backwards a little bit in order to understand where we're at, what Bill and Chris were just talking about. And we're to be looking at Ezekiel 37 and 38 the next few weeks as we study this. And so we'd like to look at Ezekiel 37 that goes back a long time ago, Chris. And really, God had predicted when the nation turned from God that there would be trouble. They would face consequences.
Sure.
And really, if we understand correctly, we started seeing that all the way from the end of Judges when Samuel became the prophet and Saul, the nation decided to choose a king, and they had Saul start reigning over them. And you almost see the nation get this downward slide where they were no longer calling God their God. They were serving other gods. And so it brings us to where we're at in chapter 37. Why don't you give a few minutes to the audience, a little background about the failures of the nation of Israel and why this time of judgment had to come upon the nation? Because we're going to talk about how eventually they ended up being nothing but dry bones.
Sure. And I guess you could even say it's kind of the history of humanity in the spiritual sense. We always go to a place of disorder. So you can start off really, really well. Think of Galatians, having begun in the spirit, will you now be made perfect in the flesh, chapter 3. What you have with Ezekiel here is he is now during the captivity that happened at the hand of the Babylonians. The northern part of the nation, the northern 10 tribes, are long since gone because of their idolatry and all the things that happened after Solomon's death. And through Jeroboam, the first king in the north, everyone that ever followed him was just as awful. And so they got into all kinds of paganism and idolatry. They were wiped out before there was a Babylon by the Assyrians. When Ezekiel writes, he's part of what's left, the remnant of the two tribes in the south. And Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon come in. They take Israel, or Judah is what it's referred to. They take Judah captive, take them back to Babylon. Ezekiel's during that captivity, and he's writing as a prophet from a foreign land. That goes from Babylon to Persia, and he's now shown this picture in chapter 37 of a nation that is in its way of being completely, overrun and kind of displaced from the land. But it's not. This is when we study through it, which we will. This is not talking about the people that are in that captivity coming back to the land from that captivity. He's talking about something that is way distant in the future. He's writing to us 2,500 plus years ago, and he's talking about events that are taking shape in our world today.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, as we'll see, there's a lot of people get confused with Bible prophecy where they try to look at these events in Ezekiel had already taken place, and we'll point out where they haven't done is just by reading what the text has to say. Bill, they became a byword, Israel, where nations around almost started making fun of them.
Yeah.
That happens when we choose not to follow the Lord.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And you can end up being mocked because what happens is that God has the ability to remove his covering from a nation or from a people. And he does that to allow the people to understand what a blessing it is to have God's covering over his people and a nation. And, we talked about this last week in church about how I believe the United States actually has been blessed to have God's hand to cover over it because it was founded as a Christian nation, and it was begun in the spirit, really, I think, with the pilgrims, in the Mayflower offshore, saying, how can we do this in a way so that we can all worship our God in the way that we want to? And that was the reason why they left Holland and England to come over here, was because they were being persecuted in Europe. And America was founded on the belief that everyone should be able to worship in the way that they wanted to. And that's why the colonies had the names they had, because, they all wanted to have a separate kind of a way to worship God in their own way. Like Maryland was for the Catholics, and, the Quakers were up in Pennsylvania, and so on. And so we look at that and we think, well, God's hand of protection was over America. And this is an example, and we see the example of the Israelites where God pulls his hand of covering back and lets them experience what it's like without God's protective hand and covering over them.
It's almost a story that gets repeated over and over in the Old Testament. Chris, you have something you want to jump in there with?
You mentioned them being a byword.
Yes.
That if they didn't, as soon as you said that, it just triggered in my mind that that's exactly what God predicted would happen if the nation decided to go wayward. You'd mentioned Saul. So the first three kings, Saul, David, Solomon. David wanted to build the temple for God, a place, a house of worship. God said, no, your son's going to do it. We get what I think is the best of all of the historical parts of it. It's found in 2 Chronicles 7. And we read in verse 19, but if you turn away and you forsake my statutes and my commandments, which I have set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot them from my land, which I have given to them. And this house that I have sanctified for my name, I will cast out of my sight, and I will make it a proverb and a byword among the people. And as for this house, which is exalted, everyone that passes by it will be astonished and say, why has the Lord done this to this land and to this house? So this is the dedication of the temple, is what we're reading about. That's the historical thing here. So even this incredible building that was put together as the house of worship, God said people are going to walk by it and go, what in the world happened?
What was that?
Right. Verse 22 is this, then they will answer, because they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they embraced other gods, worshiped them and served them. Therefore he has brought all of this calamity upon them. That is exactly what happened from the moment that the north took shape. The northern tribes under Jeroboam. That happened immediately. By the time that they fall to the Babylonians in the south, you can see from the time of Hezekiah, he has the most wicked of them all, Manasseh. And then Josiah comes in for a while, and then it goes downhill from there. And God cuts them off. They are taken out for all the reasons that were predicted all the way back to Solomon's time.
It's amazing, and that really brings us where we're at now as we see a nation in despair. I think I was talking the other day, and it's like if I was God at that point, I'd be taking a white towel and throwing it in, kind of like at a boxing match when you start like, my fighter's all done. Let's give up on them. But when we go to Ezekiel chapter 37, and we saw it last time in 36, we see the graciousness and the love of God. Aren't we so glad that God doesn't give up on us, Bill? And we haven't started looking at the scriptures, but he remains faithful. How many times have we could talk in our own life, our own personal testimony, where God didn't quit on us?
Well, and the coolest thing of all is that he uses the Jewish people as an example, and then he allows us to be grafted in through Jesus to his chosen people, and he not only redeems us and doesn't forget about us, but he is so merciful that he gives us an abundance of grace, that we're given that mercy beyond what we really deserve in any amount.
Yes.
And it's over and above what we could ever even expect or think that we could deserve. And what's so awesome is that when you come to that revelation that what God has done for you and what he eventually does for the Jewish people, you almost can't comprehend it, because it's such a demonstration of love that it's beyond man's little frail brain to figure it out. How awesome it is that God would do that for us. But like you say, he's so faithful that he never, ever fails in that regard.
You know, maybe that's you today where you've turned on this program, watching us on his channel, or else the radio network, and maybe you're feeling like, hey, I'm not feeling very good right now. I feel like kind of a loser. I've disappointed my wife, my dog, or my work, or whatever it might be. What Bill was saying is it's so beautiful that even when we're faithless, he remains faithful. It's not that we should continue in our sin and our rebellion. Just remember how faithful God is to forgive us, and we need to return back to the Lord. And that really brings us to where we're at right now in chapter 37. And I'm going to read this over a couple of verses, and I'm going to have the guys jump in and share a little bit on it. Verse number 1, it says, "The hand of the Lord was upon me," and that's Ezekiel here. "And he carried me out in the spirit of the Lord, and he set me down in the middle of the valley, which was full of bones." Now Ezekiel had this vision, of course, what we're reading right here, this vision where the Spirit took him out and he saw this valley full of bones. And he caused me to pass by them and walk around them. And behold, there was a very many lying there in the valley. Otherwise, they weren't buried. They were just laying there. And they were very dry. They were parched underneath the sun. And he said unto me, "Son of man, can these bones live?" And I answered, "O Lord, only you know." Chris or Bill, one of you guys want to jump in? Can you imagine having this crazy vision?
Well, and I think it's also really, really good for us to remember that put yourself in the position not only of Ezekiel, but also of the people who would be reading this. This would be such a comforting thing to them, and yet Ezekiel probably would have figured it out, at least by what he sees, by the time that we get to the next couple of chapters. But a person reading this might think, okay, great, God's going to reestablish us in the land. He's going to bring us back. We're coming back from our captivity. They should have expected that anyways. Jeremiah told them it was only going to be 70 years.
Yes.
And they would start that process of coming back. So it wasn't going to be a dispersion that would not have them reassembled in the land eventually. So as he writes this must be really comforting to them, because he gets the interpretation of it. Really what you've read, starting at verse 1, really runs through verse 14, and it's verses 11 to 14 where he gets the interpretation of it. But as Ezekiel's seeing this has got to be somewhat comforting to realize we're not left here alone.
And I love it, Bill, where he says, only Lord, he says, "Oh,
Yeah.
Lord God, only you know that this can happen." But the fact is it can happen.
Right.
And that's what he has his faith in, the God of all possibilities.
Yeah, it's a pretty good question too. I like the way what Ezekiel says. He says, can these bones live? And I answered, God, you're the only one that knows the answer to that, right?
Yeah, it's so cool the way he's doing this. And
Yes.
then it ties us to our last program. And Chris, you gave a pretty good insight. And I'll read it to you. And you have to go back a little bit to chapter 36, starting in verse 25, about how God was going to sprinkle them with clean water. It says, "And you will be cleansed from all your filthiness and from all your idols, and you will be cleansed." And then the Lord says, "And a new heart will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you, and I will take away the stony heart of your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh, and I will put my spirit within you, and you will walk in my statutes, and ye will keep my judgments to do them." And so this is a promise that God's given to the people. Now he's seeing this vision of these dry bones, as we talked about. The nation of Israel is dead. But yeah, God's talking about a future event that's going to happen.
Sure. It is the promise to do not just a national work in them, not just a thing as far as an ethnic group of people occupying a land. He's speaking of spiritual matters. So it'll be a relationship that he has with them and that they have with him, which again helps you to realize that God is kind of talking past what is their current predicament. We're not in the land, we're displaced. God says, "I'm going to take care of getting you back into the land." That will take place. But God's focus is, but there's a spiritual matter here that I want to address. This is what I will do in you at a future time.
He's shown that's his end game.
Yeah.
What he
that's the end game.
wants to get to. The thing is interesting. Bill, maybe we got 3-4 more minutes left where they were dispersed in 70 A.D. In fact, they were gone. They were dispersed all the way and down to China, Australia, New York, Russia, you name it. They were gone every place, and they were not a nation. They weren't in the land for thousands of years now. That almost 1948, 1900 years. What you talk about this modern day miracle that we are talking about here in this chapter?
Well, it's the only time that's ever happened in history where people have been spread throughout the world and have come back and been reunited into a new nation or the place where their origins were. And what's so cool about this to me is what Chris was just saying about how it's a spiritual story as well. And he starts to talk here in these next verses, which we'll get into, about God's going to breathe into them. And if we recall, back in Genesis, there's only a few places in the Bible where God breathes into things. And one of them is when God breathed into man. And there's another one in 2 Timothy when God breathes into the scriptures and gives them life. And there's this verse, of course, where he breathes into these bones. And so that's a whole separate understanding about the fact that they're going to have a spiritual life now that's going to be, their eyes are going to be opened, which is going to be very cool.
There's a lot of great questions, even as what Chris and Bill been talking about. When is this going to take place? When is the nation of Israel going to once again have the Spirit of God just like zealots running all over the place declaring the good news of Jesus Christ? And we want to look at those questions next week, and we want to take a look at it right down to the detail. And one of the things that's interesting for you to ponder, the nation of Israel, when they were dispersed, they kind of, like most people when they're dispersed, they become part of the society. Those who went down to China, they learned Chinese. When they went to America, they learned English. They went down to Mexico, and they learned the language, the Spanish language. But Hazael, when they started coming back, they said, you know what? To be a people, we got to learn our own language. The Hebrew language had been buried, non-existence during all this time. And Chris, you're going to be going to Israel here at the end of April or so. And when you go over there, what type of newspaper do you see there?
It's all in Hebrew.
And they speak?
Yes, they speak Hebrew.
Yeah, and that amazing miracle that God has done. And we're going to talk more about that next week as we gather together. And so on behalf of Chris and Bill, this is Terry. May God richly bless you.
Information about this broadcast, or if you have any questions, feel free to mail us at Agape Chapel OC, P.O. Box 4023, Huntington Beach, California, 92647. Or you can email us at aft@agapechapelOC.org. Or visit our website at agapechapelOC.org. Until next time,